Well, just about everyone now seems to think there will be another independence referendum, possibly next year. But what exactly would independence campaigners argue for this time? Alex Salmond, the former First Minister, tweeted "Game on" last week when a poll suggested support for independence was on the rise. Well, hopefully our technical problems are sorted out, and Alex Salmond can join me from the latest of his beauty spots beside a bridge. Listen, we'll talk about independence in a minute, but first of all, John Bercow, there's another row about him this morning because of remarks he's made about Brexit. Do you think his position is tenable?
Yes, I do, and I'm a strong supporter, as the overwhelming majority of MPs across the parties are in the House of Commons. I mean, John Bercow's always had a handful of rather crusty Tories gunning for him, not just because of remarks he made after the event to a bunch of students about Brexit. It's about things like his modernisation agenda, the fact he lets women in and babies into the House of Commons and he's taking wigs out. I mean, they've been after him for years, but it is a handful. Bercow, I think, is the significant in the most access in terms of a speaker in history, certainly the most opportunity for backbenchers. That might be mildly embarrassing for the government, but it gives them a commanding support across all parties in the House of Commons, so I'm right behind John Bercow.
Now, I presume from your tweeting "Game on" after that poll this week, you would like another referendum. I'm just curious as to what you think. From your point of view, what would be the most advantageous time to have it?
Well, let me tell you about tweeting "Game on." I was actually in conversation with a Tory minister who asked me about the Herald poll. And the reason was that there's been this comfortable assumption among the government over the last few months, despite the fact that I think it was 16 out of 17 opinion polls since Brexit have shown support for independence higher than it was in September 2014. There's this comfortable assumption, reading perhaps the mainstream media, the independent support was on the decline. So when they saw the BMG poll in the Herald earlier this week, it had a kind of traumatic effect on certainly that government minister I was speaking to, because he had thought everything was in the bag and safely under control, and then was beginning to think perhaps it wasn't.
When do you think there should be one?
Because the government is still... Right. It's significant, Gordon, because the government is still to respond to Nicola Sturgeon's compromise proposal. That's going to come over the next few weeks, and once that's done, if they reject it, as many people predict, then we'll know they're not interested in the voice of Scotland, and as Nicola Sturgeon has said, it is very likely there'll be another independence referendum. And as I've said a number of times, if there is another independence referendum, then the likely timescale, I would have said, would be the autumn of next year.
What would you say to people, and there seem to be, according to the opinion polls, quite a lot of them, who say, look, even if we're sympathetic to independence, we'd rather wait and see what the British government comes up with as a result of the Brexit negotiations, so we know exactly what it is we're voting to leave, should we vote yes. That's not an unreasonable point of view. I mean, I'm guessing, I don't know, but I'm guessing there are quite a few people like that up in where you're speaking to us from now, who perhaps were sympathetic to independence, but voted leave.
But that's not incompatible with what I've been saying, Gordon. I mean, I've seen that division, a rather curious division in the polls, between saying, do you want an independence referendum right now, which nobody, least of all Nicola Sturgeon, has been proposing, or do you want one after the Brexit negotiations? And some of our rather unscrupulous newspapers quote the first answer without adding on the second percentage. But of course, if you're talking about a referendum in about 18 months' time, by then the negotiations will be crystallised. You'll be able to tell what the deal or no deal is going to be, and certainly that's after the timescale the government was talking this week about bringing their deal or non-deal back to the House of Commons for a vote. So I don't see that as incompatible whatsoever. What I do think, however, is Nicola Sturgeon has been absolutely correct in putting forward a compromise proposal, and we have to see if the UK government is going to pay the slightest attention to the interests of Scotland, and whether Theresa May is going to honour her commitment of the 15th of July last year, when, if you remember, Gordon, she said she was looking for an agreed UK position backed by Scotland and the other devolved administrations.
If there is another referendum, what do you think the SNP should argue for? There's clearly some discussion within the party about whether to go for Scotland in Europe, to use the old slogan, or whether to argue for what Nicola Sturgeon is arguing should happen even if we stay in the UK. In other words, an independent Scotland should not immediately at least join the European Union, but should be part of the European Free Trade area. It would be in the single market, but it would not be part of the customs union, so you could say there's no question of a border between Scotland and England. Do you think that's what the SNP should argue, or should you stick to the, no, we want to leave the UK and immediately try to join the European Union?
Well, I think the SNP will continue to argue for Scotland as a member of the European Union. Why shouldn't we in a week where the mainstream media in Scotland have made total fools of themselves by presumably deliberately misinterpreting remarks from Jacqueline Minor, the European Commission's representative in the UK, who, as we know from an interview yesterday in Good Morning Scotland, said exactly the opposite of what the mainstream media and your co-presenter Andrew Neil was claiming. And therefore, that's going to be a very strong position that the SNP will argue. However, you put your point on a highly significant point. In terms of timescale, then the key matter, as was enunciated in the compromise proposal, in terms of protecting the Scottish economy and saving Scottish jobs and saving investment, is for continuing uninterrupted membership of the European Economic Area. That could, of course, be secured by membership of the European Union, but as you rightly say, there are other ways to secure it as well. So the SNP's position will be for Scotland as an independent member of the European Union. But the key negotiating priority, as Nicola Sturgeon has outlined in her proposal to the UK government, is to stay within that European Economic Area. And what that does, of course, Gordon, is suggest that the key battleground in terms of economics of any future independence referendum is not going to be, as it was the last time, like the currency, but is going to be trade and access to markets, because that is what the UK government is jeopardising, and that is what an independent Scotland could secure.
Well, I mean, just to answer a question that you asked at the beginning of that answer, the answer to why perhaps change the position in Europe is that we know that a lot of yes voters, perhaps a third of them, voted to leave the European Union. And it's a pretty difficult sell for you, isn't it, to say, look, you won the Brexit vote, even though you were sympathetic to independence. We want you immediately to vote to break up the UK and join the European Union you've just voted to leave.
Well, independent membership of the European Union for Scotland has always been the most popular of the range of constitutional options available to the country. I don't think it's a difficult sell at all. But you're right to say that Nicola Sturgeon in her compromise proposal emphasised as a priority continuing membership of the European Economic Area. Incidentally, I saw one of your programmes a few weeks ago when my old mucker Kevin Pringle made a very astute point, saying that in terms of campaigning about independence for Scotland, then people who believe in independence are likely to put that as their highest priority, and therefore should be much more amenable to being galvanised for an independence campaign than people who put other priorities first. Therefore, I'd be very confident that the progress we're seeing in support for independence can continue if the campaign is pitched in the right way.
Do you think there should be another yes campaign, or should the SNP just run this one itself?
Well, I think there should be another yes campaign. Most referendums have a yes side and a no side, and they should be cross-party and open to people of no party. I think there will be some lessons to be learned from a first campaign. I mean, I don't share the view, and you'll probably understand why, that the campaign was a failure. We didn't win the vote, but we put on 15% for the yes vote during the campaign. I mean, Gordon, if we put on another 15%, then the result would be overwhelming. So I don't think we should beat ourselves up about the structure of the campaign, but I think there are some key lessons to learn, and no doubt Nicola Sturgeon will learn them and deploy them if we get into the situation of a second independence referendum.
Out of time, but one lesson presumably is you're not going to argue again for keeping the pound, no matter how the British government protests you're not going to.
Well, if you call the second debate, the BBC debate with Alistair Darling, I thought the position I outlined in that debate was rather more successful than perhaps the earlier position. But of course, Nicola Sturgeon knows her own mind, and she'll be able to outline the range of currency options that are open to Scotland. But can I say again, the key argument that I see coming in this referendum, if that's what happens, in terms of economics, is going to be what secures Scotland's trade, our access to markets on which prosperity defend. I think independence has a winning argument on that framework, and I expect to see it expertly deployed by Nicola Sturgeon.
All right, Alex Salmond, we'll have to leave it there. It looks like you've cut the grass already, but maybe do a bit of strimming at the back there. Thank you very much indeed.